You will often hear it repeated amongst fans that the extended editions of The Lord of the Rings are the true versions of the films. This is stated as a kind of truism, and yet I very rarely hear any kind of discussion as to why this is the case, let alone if the proposition is even true on the face of it. In this video, I am going to explore the differences between both cuts of the Fellowship of the Ring, whilst also drawing attention to any potential problems that become apparent due to the inclusion of the additional material. I will explore what differences are present, what the implications of these adjustments are within the greater narrative, with regard to things like character arcs and world building, how certain parts of the story in the theatrical edition are damaged by the removal of certain scenes, and I will give an overall grade for each extended scene and offer a conclusion as to which version of the film is actually superior and why. So here we have the tier list that I'm going to be using to rank these extended scenes. We have 6 tiers. At the bottom we have garbage tier, which is for scenes that just have absolutely no merit whatsoever. Then we have D tier, which is for scenes that might have some merit to them. There might be something in them that makes them worthwhile. However, their inclusion within the greater narrative as part of a film makes the extended edition worse than it would be if those scenes were not in the film. Next is C tier, which is my take it or leave it tier. This is for scenes that I don't really have a strong opinion of. They don't really make the film better or worse, and so I don't hugely care whether or not they are actually in the film. B tier is for scenes that are good or very good, but I can absolutely see why they were cut, in most cases for pacing reasons. A tier is for scenes that are excellent and should not have been cut. And S tier is for scenes that are either absolutely critical in terms of setting up things that occur later in the trilogy, or scenes that are simply among the best scenes in The Lord of the Rings. So what we're looking for in terms of comparing whether the extended edition is better than the theatrical edition is for scenes to be ranked no lower than C. If any of these extended scenes end up in D or E, then those are points in favor of the theatrical edition. I am well aware that when you release a film theatrically, some things are outside of your control. The Lord of the Rings films in particular are already very long, and so many of my criticisms of the theatrical edition are going to be things that were knowingly compromised in order to get the film into a state in which it could feasibly be released in a cinema. And whilst I consider both versions of the film to be masterpieces, they are not perfect, and they are fundamentally different experiences due to the inclusion of additional footage, as well as various scenes that were re-edited for the extended edition. Last thing before we get started, a brief disclaimer. I am not approaching this in a how can we be as faithful to the books as possible manner. I am approaching this in a how can we get the best possible cinematic version of The Lord of the Rings manner. I say this because no doubt I will at some point suggest that a particular scene should have remained cut, and some of you may feel inclined to tell me, well, it's in the book, so therefore it should stay. So let me get this out of the way for anyone who is new to my content. A scene needs to do more than depict something that was in the book in order to justify its existence in the film. The theatrical edition already made substantial changes when adapting Tolkien's source material, and these changes were made so as to result in a better overall film, which is the same mindset that I'm going to take when analysing these extended scenes. First up then, we have Isildur's death scene, which is very slightly longer in the extended edition. In the theatrical edition, Isildur is ambushed by orcs, falls off his horse, and we then cut to his body in the river. The extended edition adds some brief fighting, depicts Isildur putting the ring on and fleeing into the river, the ring falling off his finger, and his resultant death. The main difference here is that the extended edition gives the clear impression that the ring has a mind of its own, which is later expanded upon when Gandalf explains that the ring is always trying to get back to its master, and is generally a bit of an asshole. By falling off of Isildur's finger, the ring reveals him to the orcs, and he is killed as a result, which makes Galadriel's line, "The ring betrayed Isildur to his death," far more literal in the extended edition. As in the theatrical edition, we only know that Isildur was killed whilst in possession of the ring, not that the ring directly caused his death. This helps to firmly establish the ring as an antagonistic force in and of itself, rather than simply being an evil magic ring, thereby immediately amplifying the subsequent danger that Frodo finds himself in. So, why might this sequence have been cut? Peter Jackson may well have decided not to personify the ring this early on, so as to give it a further degree of mystery and ambiguity. His intention was that the prologue was told from the perspective of the ring, with the ring as the protagonist.
In past attempts, we'd told it through the point of view of Isildur solely, or we'd tried to tell it from a kind of God's eye point of view. We tried all these different points of view, but in the end, it wasn't until we came to understand that the ring is in fact a protagonist in this story. In many ways it's an antagonist, and that what we should do is tell the prologue from the ring's point of view.
Which is an excellent idea in concept, and explicitly depicting the treachery of the ring further builds upon this idea. There were also concerns that showing the ring turning Isildur invisible would be needlessly confusing, as the audience could then be distracted trying to work out why the ring turned Isildur invisible when it did not turn Sauron invisible. This, I think, is a somewhat valid concern, although it may be difficult to fully appreciate why. It is hard to imagine being a first-time viewer of The Fellowship of the Ring in 2001, and having no prior knowledge of the setting because of how well known Peter Jackson's interpretation of Middle-earth has become. The prologue delivers an incredible amount of information to the audience, and the writers were extremely careful to avoid overwhelming their audience with too much too quickly, or with needless details that distracted from the focus and purpose of the prologue. This is the precise reason why Narsil is not named during the prologue, and neither is the Elven High King Gil-galad. The ability for the ring to turn its bearer invisible was also deemed to be too much information for the prologue, hence it being cut. However, I would dispute that given that the focus of the prologue is on the One Ring itself, portraying its arsehole nature was something that should have been kept.
The footage we've added here does show the process of how the ring ultimately caused Isildur's death, and much clearer than what was in the theatrical version.
Isildur's extended death scene primarily adds to the world building with regard to the properties of the ring. This is something that is thoroughly accomplished elsewhere in the theatrical edition, and so it is not strictly necessary to do so here. However, this is a change that I do absolutely think improves the overall film due to how it personifies the ring from the outset. So, I'm going to place Isildur's death scene solidly in A. In the theatrical edition, we transition from the prologue directly to Frodo sitting in the woods. In the extended edition, however, we go straight into our first brand new scene, concerning hobbits. In early versions of the script, The Fellowship of the Ring was not going to have any kind of prologue. This extended scene, concerning hobbits, was at one point the opening scene of the trilogy. Peter Jackson ultimately removed it, primarily because he felt it contained too much narration, and he understandably didn't want to follow up 8 minutes of prologue narration with a further 2 to 3 minutes of narration from Bilbo. The main focus of this sequence is to provide exposition to the audience, to establish what hobbits are, what the Shire is, and what life is like for these people in a broad sense. This helps to establish more of a status quo before the story of The Lord of the Rings kicks off. The first thing we see is a map of Middle-earth, and the use of maps is something that I love about these movies.
Shire, see, that kind of shows how big Middle-earth is. People...
And how big the Shire is, you know,
Yeah.
it's not just a village.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one thing in the film, when you saw it without some of that stuff, the Shire looked like was just as big as, you know.
As Hobbiton, maybe.
This not only gives a very clear sense of geography, thus making the setting far more believable than if the story was nebulously taking place in some abstract bubble where every location is an unspecified distance away from each other, but it also provides character work for Bilbo. This is the map that was given to Bilbo by Thorin during the events of The Hobbit. This is a map that Bilbo owns, and this is a map that Bilbo has recently been looking at. As we soon learn, he longs for further adventures and doesn't want to live out his years in the Shire. During this sequence, Bilbo asks twice for Frodo to get the door when Frodo is not even there. Bilbo is so wrapped up in his writing that he is unaware of his surroundings. It is quite notable that in the theatrical edition, we don't actually meet Bilbo until nearly 10 minutes later, when Gandalf knocks on his door. In the extended edition, however, we get substantial character information as well as a great deal of world building. This extended scene is also the first time we hear the Fellowship theme in a very subdued manner when the title card appears. whereas in the theatrical edition, we don't hear this theme until the hobbits leave Bree, at which point the earliest iteration of what would become the Fellowship of the Ring has been formed. Bilbo starts writing There and Back Again, chronicling his adventures as seen in The Hobbit, and this is used as a mechanism by which to deliver the aforementioned exposition to the audience. Because this is not a Zack Snyder film, the voiceover is not used to tell us in detail what Bilbo did in his past, as this would of course be irrelevant to the story of The Lord of the Rings. It instead informs the audience as to what hobbits are, what life is like in the Shire, and therefore, what Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin are fighting to protect. In the theatrical edition, we do, of course, see the Shire and hobbits doing hobbit things, but by exploring the setting before the plot actually starts, it provides contrast between a day in the life of a hobbit and a day in the life of a hobbit when Gandalf, the notorious disturber of the peace, arrives. We also first see Sam during this sequence, meaning that we actually get to see him gardening. As Bilbo's voiceover tells us, all hobbits share a love of things that grow, which is a nice touch. This entire sequence was absolutely cut for runtime, and as I will get to momentarily, the following scene of Gandalf and Frodo riding through the Shire is very different in the theatrical edition, which means that much of the exposition from the concerning Hobbit scene is instead delivered through dialogue between Frodo and Gandalf. Much of the specifics of Hobbit culture, such as the smoking of pipeweed and the consumption of ale, is established elsewhere in the film, and so it is not entirely necessary to explicitly state this through voiceover narration. We also have the first of many brief instances of comic relief that were removed, before we transition back into the theatrical edition as Bilbo asks Frodo to get the door and wonders where he is. I adore the concerning Hobbits scene, but to remain as objective as I can, I am going to place it in B, as there are clear advantages to cutting this scene, particularly in terms of pacing. Frodo and Gandalf riding through the Shire is very different in the theatrical edition. Frodo immediately asks Gandalf,
"What news of the outside world? Tell me everything."
And Gandalf replies that Frodo is far too eager and curious for a hobbit.
Life in the wide world goes on, much as it has this past day. I'm scarcely aware of the existence of hobbits, for which I am very thankful.
This establishes that hobbits typically keep to themselves, which was also established in the concerning hobbits extended scene, which means that the theatrical edition doesn't suffer too much from its exclusion. As Gandalf and Frodo ride through the Shire, we also see snippets of footage that are repurposed and expanded upon in the concerning hobbits extended scene that came previously. The way the theatrical edition sets up the Shire and the hobbits is extremely impressive, largely because they did not have the luxury of runtime. Without the prior extended scene, the theatrical edition needed to accomplish multiple things in an extremely short amount of time. The film needed to establish what life is like in the Shire, that Bilbo is having a party, and that hobbits keep to themselves, whilst also introducing the audience to the characters of Frodo and Gandalf. And it accomplishes all of the above excellently in the space of barely 3 minutes. In the extended edition, however, much of this dialogue is removed because it would simply be a repetition of what had already been established in the prior scene. Bilbo instead delivers further narration, very similar to Gandalf's dialogue in the theatrical edition.
And so life in the Shire goes on, very much as it has this past age.
Life in the wide world goes on, much as it has this past age.
One interesting detail in the extended edition is that Bilbo states that there has always been a Baggins living at Bag End, and there always will be. Due to the subsequent events of The Lord of the Rings, Bilbo is mistaken. There will not be a Baggins living there at the end of the trilogy. One other small but important difference in the dialogue between the two versions of the film is that in the theatrical edition, Frodo says,
You know Bilbo. He's got the whole place in an uproar. Half the Shire's been invited. He's up to something. All right, then, keep your secrets.
In the theatrical edition, Frodo appears to be strictly speaking about Bilbo's birthday party. Frodo's concern is, oh, what has my crazy uncle got planned for the party? Which is a very innocent, mundane, and trivial concern. And Frodo does not appear to be genuinely worried about Bilbo's health. In the extended edition, however, Frodo says,
To tell you the truth, Bilbo's been a bit odd lately. He's taken to locking himself in his study. He spends hours and hours poring over old maps when he thinks I'm not looking. He's up to something. All right, then, keep your secrets.
In the extended edition, Frodo is explicitly voicing his concern regarding Bilbo's suspicious behavior to Gandalf, and this is relating to Bilbo's plan to leave the Shire with the ring. This is far more sinister in the extended edition, which is further amplified by the brief scene in which Bilbo panics, believing that he has misplaced the ring, further establishing its highly addictive nature. This particular sequence was trimmed because the writers didn't want Bilbo to be introduced to the audience as a weird character.
I know one of the concerns that Fran had when we were contemplating this version for the theatrical release of the film was that she was worried that it would establish Bilbo as a slightly darker character. That Bilbo is obviously a very lovable, cute hobbit, but the fact that we would first see him introduced in this way, being a little bit weird, sort of, acting in a slightly compulsive, unusual way. I know Fran was concerned that it would lead to expectations of who Bilbo was that is not really true, that obviously he's just having a strange little episode here because of the way that this ring is affecting him, but he is basically, obviously, his usual lovable self. But it's possibly not the best way to introduce the character by seeing him in this manner first.
Which I can understand. However, the simple fact is that Bilbo has the One Ring, and it is appropriately having an effect on him, and therefore he should be behaving in a weird manner. Overall, I fully appreciate the extra depth provided by these two scenes in the extended edition. However, I also understand the decision to remove them from the theatrical version. These scenes are primarily focused on world building and exposition, and much of this information is delivered in the theatrical edition anyway through dialogue between Frodo and Gandalf. Most of the additional character information in the extended scenes is relating specifically to Bilbo, and although I think it is excellent, Bilbo is not as important as some of the other characters who receive development in extended scenes. And so the decision to trim these scenes and keep the film moving and focused primarily on the character of Frodo is a decision that I fully understand. I am also going to place the Shire extended scene in B. In the theatrical edition, Bilbo is interrupted by an angry knock at the door, whereupon he tells Gandalf that he doesn't want his relatives to know that he is home because they are pissing him off. This is very quick and simple and seemingly needs no elaboration. Bilbo wants to be left alone to indulge in his books and maps, and he is not interested in socializing with people that he doesn't like. In the extended edition, however, Bilbo names the relatives as the Sackville Bagginses and tells Gandalf that they are after the house and that they have never forgiven him for living this long. This is almost certainly paranoia brought on by the influence of the ring, and Bilbo's claim about his relatives wanting his house may well not be entirely true. This is a very small change, but it is extremely important. Firstly, the extended edition adds an explanation as to why, specifically, Bilbo doesn't like his relatives, whereas in the theatrical edition it comes across as though Bilbo is a weird cantankerous recluse who gets unnecessarily anxious whenever someone knocks on his door. And secondly, this is the second reference to the ring having some kind of supernatural effect upon Bilbo. Gandalf already observed that he hasn't aged a day, and Bilbo jokes in this scene that his relatives have never forgiven him for living as long as he has, thereby not only providing a dose of comic relief, but also foreshadowing that what happened to Gollum will happen to Bilbo, thereby planting the idea that something is happening to Bilbo, and that his behavior and appearance may not be entirely natural. In both cuts, we get the quick shot of Gandalf noticing Bilbo reaching into his pocket and becoming suspicious. This works far better in the extended edition, however, because Gandalf has a reason to believe that Bilbo may be acting suspiciously, given his conversation with Frodo.
Bilbo's been a bit odd lately. I mean, more than usual.
Bilbo acting strangely is not a narrative component of the theatrical edition. As this conversation is not present in the theatrical edition, we have no prior suggestion that anything is wrong with Bilbo, apart from our knowledge that Bilbo presumably still has the ring that we saw him take from Gollum during the prologue. None of this works particularly well at all, however, if we acknowledge what happened in the subsequent Hobbit trilogy as being canonical with the Lord of the Rings trilogy, as Gandalf explicitly knew that Bilbo had a magic ring the whole time, didn't care to ask to even look at it, and doesn't begin to suspect anything until he sees Bilbo turn invisible at the party, despite knowing that Bilbo used a magic ring to escape Goblin Town and later to help Thorin during the Battle of the Five Armies. These faults, however, lie with the Hobbit trilogy, not the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And so if we just kind of ignore the Hobbit movies, the Fellowship of the Ring remains entirely undamaged. I am going to place Very Old Friends in A, as it gives excellent character development in a very short amount of time, and it helps to slowly ramp up the tension as we see Gandalf's suspicions being raised. During the extended party scene, we have a brief conversation between Bilbo and Mrs. Bracegirdle, after which he hides from the Sackville Bagginses and has a conversation with Frodo. The conversation with Mrs. Bracegirdle accomplishes nothing beyond depicting Bilbo as enjoying socializing at his party before he is interrupted. The reason this exists is because it feeds into Bilbo hearing the Sackville Bagginses coming, although the nature of the brief conversation with Mrs. Bracegirdle doesn't actually have any impact upon either the story or the characters. Bilbo then runs away from the Sackville Bagginses again, before taking the opportunity to have a rather serious chat with Frodo, which is informed by the fact that he knows he is going to run off after the party, and he wants to say goodbye to Frodo without saying goodbye to Frodo. In the theatrical edition, Bilbo just kinda takes off and doesn't bother to tell Frodo anything. In both cuts, Frodo says that Bilbo talked for so long about leaving, but he never thought he would actually do it. And this line works far, far better in the extended edition, because we have multiple references for Bilbo's strange behavior, that he is acting suspiciously, that he is locking himself away and spooling through maps, that he wants to get out there and see mountains again, multiple suggestions that the ring is influencing his behavior, and the fact that Bilbo's behavior at the party clearly worried Frodo. In the theatrical edition, we only get about half of these references. We know that he wants to get out there and see the mountains again, and that the ring is influencing his behavior. Whilst this is sufficient to explain Bilbo's actions, the fact that he leaves without saying goodbye to Frodo in particular in the theatrical edition is jarring and very strange. This is somewhat mitigated by the fact that, in the theatrical edition, Bilbo and Frodo do not actually speak to each other until Rivendell. No, I am not joking. The only scene in which Bilbo and Frodo speak prior to Rivendell is this extended scene at the party. Frodo's relationship with Bilbo in the theatrical edition is not anywhere near as well developed as it is in the extended edition, which means that Bilbo disappearing without a word is somewhat less out of place than it would have been had this happened in the extended edition. Anyway, Bilbo claims that he is selfish for having taken Frodo in after his parents died, as the reason he did so was because he believed Frodo was the one Baggins who showed real spirit. This explains why Frodo lives with his uncle, by clarifying that his parents are dead, but as Frodo's parents are not relevant at all to the story of the Lord of the Rings, I consider this to be extra fluff that is nice but not necessary. What is necessary, however, is that this line sets up Frodo as being unlike the other hobbits, which has not yet been established in the extended edition. Gandalf's line,
"But eager and curious for a hobbit, that's natural,"
was only present in the theatrical edition. By including the Sackville Bagginses a second time, this also helps to contrast Frodo with the other Bagginses, as well as with the other hobbits in general. Additionally, once again, we have a small injection of comic relief.
Bilbo, have you been at the Gaffer's home brew?
No? Well, yes, but that's not the point.
Overall, this small scene at the party is primarily focused on Bilbo, hence the decision to remove it from the theatrical cut, but as it relates specifically to Bilbo's relationship with Frodo, and as it explains some of Bilbo's actions that are less clear in the theatrical edition, I think this scene absolutely earns its place in the film, and I'm going to place it in A. Next up, we have an extended scene at the Green Dragon, which gives us a bit more pre-adventure time with the four main hobbits, and further depicts what life is generally like in the Shire. This scene is broadly superfluous, and it was cut because it slows the momentum of the film, but it does accomplish a few things. It establishes that strange folk have been seen in the Shire, thus foreshadowing that times are changing and the norm is being disrupted. It also further feeds into the idea that Bilbo is known to be a bit of a crackpot, provides a small amount of further romantic tension between Sam and Rosie, and again, another smidgen of comic relief.
Boy, mind who you're sweet talking. Rosie knows an idiot when she sees one. Does she?
How well then does the scene justify itself? The locals at the pub discussing how strange folk have been seen is not particularly necessary, because who these strange folk are is unknown and irrelevant to the plot of The Lord of the Rings, and so this guy is presumably talking in a more general sense about how hobbits like to keep to themselves.
Keep your nose out of trouble, and no trouble will come to you.
Yes, this scene takes place immediately after we see a Nazgul elsewhere in the Shire, but I highly doubt that anyone would casually refer to something that looks like a Nazgul as strange folk. Even if this guy is referring to the presence of a Nazgul in the Shire, this is still not necessary because it does not feed into anything else later in the film. It could also potentially be referring to the elves we are about to see in the next extended scene, or potentially dwarves traveling to the Blue Mountains. Either way, it is irrelevant to the plot of The Lord of the Rings. Bilbo being known as a crackpot is also not a particularly necessary addition, as this has already been well established in the extended edition. Something that is lost with this scene's removal, however, is that we never see Frodo interacting with Merry or Pippin until they encounter each other in Farmer Maggot's field, and the audience is left to assume, oh, well, I guess they know each other. This scene, however, shows that they are good friends who enjoy socializing at the pub. The main draw of this scene, I think, is the Sam and Rosie stuff, because this gets a big payoff at the end of the trilogy, and in the theatrical edition we have, 5 seconds of setup in the Fellowship of the Ring? However, this scene only adds about 10 more seconds to this setup, and it is not particularly insightful, just more of the same boy likes girl, but isn't brave enough to talk to her. The nature of Sam's relationship with Rosie is adequately set up during the scene at Bilbo's party, and in the theatrical edition we also see them leaving the Green Dragon, and so the somewhat comedic additional dialogue indicating Sam's potential jealousy could definitely be described as unnecessary. Peter Jackson does regret cutting this scene from the theatrical edition, but I can totally see why he made this decision. It reiterates information that had already been established, and whilst it does add a tiny amount of character information for Frodo, Sam, and Rosie, this information is not crucial at this point, and its inclusion does marginally slow down the pacing of the film at the 30-minute mark. I'm going to place At the Green Dragon in C. I don't mind it, but I don't think it does quite enough to justify itself given the impact that it has on the pacing of the film. Shortly after leaving the Shire, Frodo and Sam witness some elves as they travel to the Grey Havens. The primary function of this is to set up the Grey Havens, but as the Grey Havens do not become relevant until the return of the king, it is extremely weird to slow down Frodo and Sam's adventure the moment it starts so as to introduce a concept that will not appear again for about 10 hours. It is also a bit odd that the Shire is supposedly very isolated from the rest of Middle-earth, and yet 2 minutes after leaving, they encounter a procession of elves, which gives the impression that this kind of thing is not particularly abnormal. However, through setting up the Grey Havens, the writers establish that Frodo knows about the Grey Havens, thus reinforcing that he is very much unlike most other hobbits in that he is very curious and relatively well informed about the outside world. We also get a small amount of character work between Frodo and Sam, whereby Sam can't sleep, whereas Frodo is far more comfortable not being at home. This is good, but given the extensive character work we receive for Frodo and Sam in these films, this small moment in and of itself is not enough to justify this scene's inclusion. In the theatrical edition, there is a sense of progression through the various mundane races before we start seeing the more fantastical ones. Frodo and Sam start in the Shire, with seemingly very limited knowledge of the outside world. In Bree, they encounter the race of men, in Rivendell they encounter the elves and dwarves, and after setting out to destroy the ring, they encounter various evil creatures in the form of goblins, trolls, and eventually the Balrog. This has a clear sense of progression, as the strangeness, otherworldliness, and threat level of these creatures becomes more pronounced as the hobbits leave their home and journey into Middle-earth. The obvious exception to this progression is the Nazgul, who clearly do not belong, hence them being treated by the characters as exceedingly dangerous and threatening. They are a massive departure from the kinds of things hobbits are used to. They are a supernatural evil, and this contrast is unfortunately somewhat lessened in the extended edition by immediately depicting a procession of elves, a supernatural good, just outside the Shire. Overall, I feel that this is the first scene that strictly detracts from the extended edition, primarily for pacing reasons. As soon as Frodo and Sam head out on their journey, the narrative stops in order to do some world building that could have been done elsewhere. By omitting this scene and cutting straight to the ominous shot of the Nazgul before we pick up with Gandalf as he rides to Isengard, the theatrical edition excellently maintains the tension and urgency of Frodo's quest. The ring must leave the Shire because the Nazgul are looking for it. By focusing the narrative on Frodo and his mission, the theatrical edition is able to gradually build momentum and intensity as he ventures into the unknown. The extended edition, conversely, implies that the outside world is not that dangerous or mysterious, given that the first thing they encounter is a peaceful procession of elves. The passing of the elves, controversially, is going in D, because I do genuinely believe that if you remove this scene, the pacing of the beginning of Fellowship of the Ring is substantially improved. After the hobbits arrive in Bree, there are two tiny changes. Firstly, when the gatekeeper identifies the hobbits as being from the Shire.
Hobbits? Four hobbits? What's more, out of the Shire by your talk? What business brings you to Bree? Hobbits? Four hobbits? What business brings you to Bree?
And later, when the innkeeper says,
Good evening, little masters. What can I do for you? If you're looking for accommodation, we've got some nice, cosy, hobbit-sized rooms available. Always proud to cater to the little folk, Mr. Good evening, little masters. If you're seeking accommodation, we've got some nice, cosy, hobbit-sized rooms available, Mr.
These two changes are, again, tiny. I have no idea why Peter Jackson decided to cut these three very specific lines of dialogue, amounting to about 6 seconds of screen time. Maybe it was because he thought the innkeeper was too nice and he wanted him to be less overtly polite and welcoming. I have no idea. Shortly afterwards, we have another very brief line which is omitted from the theatrical edition. When Merry asks, "How do we know Strider is a friend of Gandalf?" Frodo responds,
I think a servant of the enemy would look fairer, feel fouler.
It's foul enough.
Whereas in the theatrical edition, he simply says, "We have no choice but to trust him." This additional line tells us that Frodo is perceptive and cautious, and offers an explanation as to why he has decided to leave Bree with Aragorn instead of waiting for Gandalf as originally planned. This particular line was apparently cut for urgency reasons, to keep the story moving forward, and it isn't entirely a necessary addition, as Bree was no longer a safe place for them to be, and the Nazgul's presence is justification enough for them to follow Aragorn, but again, the decision to make such a tiny change is odd. I am going to place the Bree changes in C. I don't really have strong feelings either way, and I honestly don't think much, if anything, is gained or lost with the inclusion or exclusion of these, 4 lines of dialogue. The next deleted scene features the hobbits travelling through the Midgewater Marshes, which helps give the world a sense of scale and suggests the passage of time. And we also have another brief moment of comic relief.
What do they eat when they can't get hobbit?
We then see Aragorn hunt a deer for them to eat, indicating his skill and suggesting that he does not have any ulterior motives, whereas his true nature and motives are far more mysterious in the theatrical edition. The extended edition makes it very clear that Aragorn is not a threat to the hobbits, whereas in the theatrical edition things are more ambiguous until we directly see him battle the Nazgul at Weathertop. We then have Frodo being awoken by Aragorn quietly singing something in Elvish, and I'm not going to fully go into the tale of Beren and Luthien here, because my knowledge of it is limited, but from a strict character development perspective, this interaction with Frodo functions as something of a setup for Aragorn's relationship with Arwen, as well as foreshadowing what will inevitably happen. Importantly, the audience has not met Arwen yet, and so this mention of Beren and Luthien will only mean anything to people familiar with Tolkien's work. None of this has anything to do with Frodo, nor does it have anything to do with Frodo's mission to destroy the ring, so whilst I fully appreciate how it serves Aragorn's character, its removal does improve the pacing of the film. I'm going to place the Midgewater Marshes extended scene in B. This next addition is a minor change in which Sam points out what remains of the 3 trolls that were turned to stone in The Hobbit. This is fan service, and unfortunately, there isn't much else to it. In the theatrical edition, we clearly see the 3 stone trolls in the background of the scene, as the characters discuss what has happened to Frodo.
He's passing into the Shadow World. He'll soon become a wraith like them.
The extended edition adds a line from Sam explicitly telling Frodo, "Look, it's Mr. Bilbo's trolls." This requires that Sam is aware of Bilbo's past adventures, which lines up as we see earlier in the film Bilbo excitedly recounting his tale to a group of children. It also requires that Sam is able to recognize that these 3 gigantic stone monstrosities are trolls, and therefore that they are the same ones Bilbo encountered. And it requires that Sam decided to point this out to his badly injured friend in order to try and comfort him. Character-wise, this indicates that Sam is actively caring for Frodo, but as the scene as it exists in the theatrical edition already thoroughly depicts Sam caring for Frodo, this additional line absolutely comes off as fan service with no other purpose. Yes, the fan service already exists in the theatrical edition, but it is in the background and does not detract or distract from what is happening in the scene. Maybe the writers figured that having a character draw verbal attention to an Easter egg that people who had read The Hobbit would recognize would distract from what is actually happening during this sequence. That Frodo has just been mortally wounded and is going to die. In other words, given that his friend, whose safety he is personally responsible for, has just been stabbed in the chest by a malevolent spirit wielding an evil sword, is Sam going to be thinking, "Oh, I recognize these trolls from Bilbo's stories"? Or is he going to be thinking, "Holy shit, my friend is going to die"?
This is the Trollshore Forest, which obviously fans know that the 3 stone trolls are Bilbo's. Actually, in the theatrical version of the film, we never even referenced the fact that they were these 3 stone trolls, but we did have Bilbo telling the story at the beginning of the movie, so we hoped that people would make the connection. But it's another one of those things that I don't really believe you need to explain everything in Tolkien's world as you see it on film. You know, fans of the book know what they're looking at, and if you haven't read the book, it doesn't really matter. There just happens to be 3 big stone trolls there.
Which I agree with, but then this makes the decision to have Sam explain that these are Bilbo's trolls rather confusing. I don't think that fan service is inherently a bad thing, but I do think that there is a time and a place, and this was neither the time nor the place. Therefore, I do think that if you remove the 3 seconds or so of Sam telling Frodo about the trolls, it is a strict improvement to the overall film. And so, we have our second D. Fast forward all the way to Rivendell. The next change is Boromir's brief exchange with Aragorn. In the theatrical edition, Aragorn is reading a book. Boromir observes the painting, picks up Narsil, accidentally cuts his finger, notices Aragorn, and drops it, before Aragorn picks it up and places it back on the pedestal. In the theatrical edition, Boromir does not ever actually address or acknowledge Aragorn's presence, and because of how the scene is cut together, poorly in my view, as here for instance Boromir turns a full 180 degrees in between cuts, Boromir doesn't even look at Aragorn, despite Aragorn being sat in clear view. Boromir proceeds to talk about the shards of Narsil, and because he never looks at or acknowledges Aragorn's presence, despite him being sat right in front of him, it is unclear if he is talking to himself or talking to Aragorn, and he only looks at Aragorn after cutting himself on the blade, suggesting that he maybe felt embarrassed after having cut himself on the blade that brought down Sauron, a blade that is not his to wield. He suspected that he was being watched, realised that Aragorn was sat right there, and then dropped Narsil before leaving the room. This is functional as an introduction to Boromir, but I vastly prefer his introduction in the extended edition. After looking at the painting, Boromir recognises that Aragorn is not an elf, and wonders who he is and why he is in Rivendell. As we learn in the extended edition of The Two Towers, Boromir has no real idea of why he has been summoned to Rivendell. He only has his father's somewhat educated guess.
Elrond of Rivendell has called a meeting. He will not say why, but I have guessed its purpose. The weapon of the enemy has been found.
The One Ring.
If Denethor is correct in his suspicions, then Boromir's task is to bring the One Ring to his father. Therefore, Boromir will have to convince most, possibly all, of the other people at the council to allow him to take the ring to Gondor. He needs to know who Aragorn is, so that he can be confident that Aragorn will not get in his way. Aragorn then responds that men of the south are welcome, indicating that Aragorn recognizes Boromir as the son of the steward of Gondor. It is perhaps possible that Aragorn merely recognized Boromir's attire as being that of a Gondorian, but I think it is more likely that he specifically recognized Boromir, given who Boromir is. It is in fact entirely possible that Aragorn knew who else was going to be present at the council, and so he was fully expecting to have to deal with Boromir at some point, hence his cautious attitude during this scene. Boromir then directly asks Aragorn who he is, which indicates that Boromir has absolutely no idea who he is speaking to. This is also the case in the theatrical edition, as the two exchange words briefly during the Council of Elrond before Legolas reveals Aragorn's true identity. But this extended scene excellently adds further tension between these two characters. As Aragorn does not want Boromir to know who he is, he states that he is a friend of Gandalf the Grey. He notably doesn't use his alias Strider, because Boromir may well know that Strider and Aragorn are the same person. The reason he does this is because he has no interest in beefing with Boromir, and he has a very good idea of what Boromir's reaction will be if or when Boromir realizes who he is. Boromir will immediately butt heads with him, which will likely make it harder to reach any kind of resolution with regard to the ring. Boromir then suggests that the two of them are friends, as they are both here for the same reason, but Aragorn does not appear to reciprocate the sentiment.
We are here on common purpose, friend.
Alright.
Boromir reveals a lot to Aragorn during this scene, whereas Aragorn reveals nothing to Boromir, and Boromir does not like someone else having more power than him. Unsatisfied and confused by Aragorn's lack of response, only then does Boromir approach the shards of Narsil, his narration to the audience this time being clearly justified by the fact that he obviously knows that Aragorn is present. He confidently approaches the blade and holds it in his hands, because this is a legendary relic of his people, and he may imagine that he is worthy to wield it, and also to posture in front of Aragorn and show off. Upon cutting himself, thus revealing that he is not as strong as he thinks he is, that he is ignorant, that the blade of his people has rejected him, that he has just instinctively picked up and disrespected an ancient relic, he then looks to Aragorn, and upon seeing Aragorn's silent, disapproving gaze, he drops the blade and leaves, stating that it is nothing more than a broken handle. Boromir is a very proud man, and his mishandling of Narsil is evidence of his inadequacy. He is terrified that Gondor will fall, and he doubts that he will be able to prevent this. If he can't display enough self-control to not cut himself on an ancient broken sword, how can he possibly hope to resist the temptation of the One Ring? In the extended edition, Boromir lays these emotions bare with the knowledge that Aragorn is watching him. In the theatrical edition, Boromir only realizes afterwards that he was being watched, which drastically simplifies their overall exchange. This extended scene also explains why Boromir is such an asshole to Aragorn during the council.
And what would a ranger know of this matter?
Without this extended scene, the presumption is that Boromir is either just a bit of a prick or that the ring is corrupting him. But with this extended scene, he has already interacted with Aragorn, and he has reason to dislike him. As with virtually every prior cut scene, this one will have been removed because it is not focused on Frodo. However, arguably the most effective emotional climax of the trilogy involves Boromir and Aragorn, and so the theatrical edition loses points for omitting this scene. I am therefore going to place it solidly in A tier. Moving on to the Council of Elrond, and we get another extended Boromir scene, which unfortunately is going to be something of a recurring pattern with the theatrical edition. Boromir is the character who suffers the most through the omission of the extended scenes. Anyway, in the theatrical edition, Elrond asks Frodo to bring forth the ring. Everyone then looks at it, and we cut to Boromir saying, "It is a gift to the foes of Mordor, why not use this ring?" This immediately depicts the corruption of the ring, as it has already been established that the ring corrupts the hearts of men, and so, fittingly, the first thing that happens after the ring is presented to the council is that it corrupts the hearts of men. In the extended edition, however, things play out slightly differently. Boromir speaks of a dream he had, which I know may have a deeper meaning in the lore involving Faramir, but I'm going to keep this video strictly relating to the films. Boromir's dream was that the eastern sky went dark. In the west, a light lingered. Voices cried that doom is near at hand, for Isildur's bane is found. This quite clearly refers to his fear of Mordor becoming more powerful, that the free peoples of Middle-earth are desperately clinging on, and proclaiming that as the One Ring has been found, Sauron will no doubt reacquire it, and so the doom of Middle-earth is near at hand. As Boromir is very well aware of the threat of Mordor, and given his specific reason for being here, as explored in a deleted scene in the Two Towers, Boromir is acting through fear of what will happen if the enemy ever gets their hands on the ring. He wants to take it to Gondor, and the last thing he wants is to destroy it. He is, of course, also being corrupted by the ring to some degree, although the ambiguity of this is only really explored in the extended edition. He then reaches for the ring. Elrond begins to tell him to stop, at which point Gandalf speaks the Black Speech so as to intimidate Boromir into backing away. This serves two purposes. One is that Gandalf is saying some magic words and freaking people out. The other is that the words he is speaking are the words that are inscribed upon the ring itself. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, etc. The question that remains unclear is who at the council can understand what Gandalf is actually saying. Going purely from the film, it could well be none of them, but I would guess that maybe Elrond and the other elves present would have understood the words being spoken. Gandalf is therefore reminding them that the One Ring is pure fucking evil and was created by Sauron to control Middle-earth. Frodo, Aragorn, Boromir, and the dwarves likely would not understand this, and to them, this would be a case of watching Gandalf use loud noises to scare away Boromir. After he finishes speaking the Black Speech, Elrond is rather pissed off that Gandalf has spoken the tongue of Mordor in Rivendell, which has apparently never been done before. Gandalf, however, does not apologize and explains to the council that the Black Speech of Mordor may yet be heard in every corner of Middle-earth, thus impressing upon them the seriousness of this meeting and the stakes that are in play. This means that, even if no one else present actually understood that he was reciting the text written on the One Ring, the point he was making is crystal clear. Gandalf then reiterates to Boromir specifically that the ring is evil, prompting Boromir to respond,
"It is a gift."
At which point the film ties back in with the theatrical edition. This, alongside the extended scene in the Two Towers, totally recontextualizes Boromir's subsequent dialogue regarding using the ring against Sauron. In the theatrical edition, he comes off almost as superstitious, immediately seeing the ring as a gift against their enemies that has come out of the blue. And he explains, hey guys, why not use the ring? I'm totally not being corrupted by it, just give it to me, I promise. In the extended edition, however, he has been tasked by his father with retrieving the weapon of their enemy so as to better protect the rest of Middle-earth, so that his people don't have to die to keep everyone else safe. He is so driven towards furthering this goal that he continues to speak even after a literal wizard stopped him from approaching the ring moments earlier, thus immediately establishing that Boromir is not going to let this go. He is extremely persistent, and he does not allow anyone else to present any alternative plan before he has had his say. And his becoming visibly emotional when explaining how the blood of his people keeps Mordor at bay makes slightly more sense if we include the scene of him recounting his dream and reaching for the ring, only to be prevented from taking it by Gandalf. Overall, this extended edition primarily serves the character of Boromir, and as the theatrical edition removes any and all scenes that do not advance the story of Frodo, it was unfortunately cut. This, alongside multiple other scenes, means that Boromir, as seen in the theatrical edition, is a vastly simplified character when compared to his characterization in the extended edition, and given the overall importance of Boromir to the Fellowship of the Ring in particular, this scene is deserving of its place in the film, and so I am going to place it in A. The next new scene occurs immediately after the Council of Elrond, where the theatrical edition cuts directly to Bilbo giving Frodo Sting and the Mithril Shirt. The extended edition features a scene of Aragorn discussing his lineage with Elrond. Aragorn's lineage was revealed to the audience during the Council of Elrond scene.
You owe him your allegiance. This is Isildur's heir, and heir to the throne of Gondor.
You are Isildur's heir, not Isildur himself.
And so this is absolutely an unanswered question in the theatrical edition. The film drops this on us, but then this idea is not actually developed until much later in the trilogy. In this extended scene, we see Aragorn at his mother's tomb, which is something that makes sense as he is about to embark on an extremely dangerous quest, and he would want to pay his respects before he leaves. Elrond explains to Aragorn something that Aragorn already knows, that his mother brought him to Rivendell as a child so as to protect him, as his life will always be in danger, as he is the last of Isildur's bloodline. The justification for this is that Elrond is trying to convince Aragorn to fulfill his destiny, to wield the Sword of Kings, to defeat Sauron, and to assume his rightful place as the King of Gondor. Aragorn, however, does not want this responsibility, despite him being the sole remaining descendant from the line of kings. This is an important scene that was cut for, you guessed it, pacing reasons.
When we cut the film theatrically, we decided that once the Fellowship were formed, we had to obviously give Frodo the Mithril Vest and Sting, but we wanted to leave Rivendell as quickly as possible, and that was purely a momentum decision of just wanting to punch the film forward to its next act.
The backstory information involving Aragorn's mother is not crucial. However, we do learn multiple bits of information that are not revealed or expanded upon until much later in the theatrical edition. This scene sets up the fact that the elves have the ability to reforge Narsil, and thereby symbolically reforge the race of men under one ruler, Aragorn. It also plugs the potential hole as to why the elves have not reforged Narsil already, and without this setup, Elrond just kind of shows up in The Return of the King to give Aragorn the reforged sword, and the question as to why this wasn't an option earlier is never brought up. Additionally, this scene establishes Aragorn's reluctance to become king, which directly impacts his relationship with Boromir in particular, which I will get to later. This scene is minor, but sets up two very important narrative beats that absolutely enhance the extended edition, so I will place it in A. After the scene with Frodo and Bilbo, the extended edition adds a scene depicting Elrond addressing the Fellowship as they depart. He states that no oath nor bond is laid to go further than they will, thus reiterating that all 8 of them are accompanying Frodo because they want to, not because they have to. They are all of them putting their own lives at risk to try to defeat Sauron. Elrond continues that the blessings of the elves, men, and free folk go with them, and he does not acknowledge the dwarves specifically, despite dwarves being present at the council, and despite Gimli being a member of the Fellowship. This is not explicitly disrespectful, and Gimli notably does not respond to this. Elrond's choice of words likely emerges as a result of the fact that the elves and the dwarves simply do not like, nor do they trust, each other. This is very small, but it helps to provide a backdrop for the character arcs that both Gimli and Legolas will go on throughout the trilogy. Aragorn also briefly says goodbye to Arwen, which makes sense as she would be present, but this isn't really enough reason on its own to include this scene. We then get an excellent character moment for Frodo.
Mordor Gandalf, is it left or right?
Left.
This establishes that although there are 5 seasoned warriors in the Fellowship with vast knowledge and experience of Middle-earth, this is Frodo's quest. Frodo is the leader of the Fellowship, and he has no idea what he is getting himself into. Immediately, the film depicts Frodo as needing help from his companions in the most mundane of ways. He doesn't know whether to turn left or right when leaving Rivendell, and so Gandalf advises him. making it very clear that he can't possibly complete his quest unless all 9 of them work together, despite their differences. This becomes relevant later in the series, as Frodo of course decides to travel alone, but then only succeeds thanks to Sam and later Gollum. I do thoroughly appreciate this scene, although it isn't quite as necessary as some of the others. Given the desire to trim the fat out of Rivendell, my choice would be to cut this scene before cutting any of the other extended Rivendell scenes, as I consider them to be more important, and so I will place this one in B. Shortly afterwards, the theatrical edition depicts Boromir training Merry and Pippin in how to use their daggers, and it turns into a play fight. In the extended edition, Aragorn tries to break up the scuffle, only to be flipped on his back by the Hobbits. Aragorn sees their game as getting out of hand, and he wants them to act like adults instead of children. He tells the Hobbits, "Gentlemen, that's enough," before the 2 Hobbits grab his feet and flip him onto the ground. This is a funny moment, and it further shows the kinship between Merry and Pippin. They have very likely done this before, and they both immediately turn and grab Aragorn's legs. However, the idea of Aragorn wanting to break up their scuffle is interesting. He is clearly entertained by watching the Hobbits playfully attack Boromir, and this is obviously not anything close to an actual fight. So why would Aragorn want to stop them from having fun? My best guess is that originally the Hobbits were sparring with Boromir, which served a practical purpose. They have absolutely 0 combat experience, and so it is not simply a case of fun and games. Once the practical purpose is lost, it becomes a wrestling match on the ground, and so Aragorn attempts to put a stop to it so as to refocus the Hobbits. This kind of action from Aragorn does occur later, after the Moria sequences where he tells the others to get the Hobbits together so that they can keep moving, leaving no time to grieve Gandalf. In both scenes, Boromir is very sympathetic to the Hobbits. In one instance, he continues playing with them until he notices the flock of Crebain, and in the other instance, by telling Aragorn to allow the Hobbits a moment to grieve. These few seconds were potentially cut because the writers didn't want Aragorn to become a joke character. They wanted him to be very serious and very focused, and so didn't want to use him in the name of comedy. That isn't to say that Boromir is a joke character, because the writers managed to draw comedy out of his bond with Merry and Pippin. In the case of Aragorn, however, he is caught off guard by 2 hobbits, and he is thrown onto his back as a result, which one could say somewhat diminishes his authority. I think it is more likely, however, that the writers cut this moment so as to not distract from the specific bond between Boromir and the 2 hobbits, which is, of course, tied to an extremely important emotional payoff later in the film. By involving Aragorn in this sequence, it arguably makes their relationship specifically with Boromir less special, and so I am going to give this alteration a B. Up next is another very short line of dialogue that was removed from the theatrical edition.
We cannot stay here! This will be the death of the Hobbits!
Again, this is a tiny and baffling change. Removing this line from the theatrical edition saves about 3 seconds. Boromir cares for the Hobbits, as seen multiple times. Boromir wants a decision to be made right fucking now, even if someone other than Frodo has to make it. This actually contrasts him with Gandalf, who has decided to leave the decision up to Frodo due to his own fear of going through the mines of Moria, which makes the fact that Boromir cares so much for the Hobbits that much more powerful. Frodo is uncertain about what to do, as he does not fully understand the consequences of which path he chooses. He has 3 options: continue over the mountains, go through the mines as suggested by Gimli, or take the Gap of Rohan and head for Gondor as suggested by Boromir. Frodo will have no idea what any of this means, and so by including this extra line from Boromir, it makes it slightly clearer that Frodo is making a snap decision under a large amount of stress. This is still a tiny change, so it doesn't hugely matter either way, but I'm going to give this change an A. Immediately after this, we have 3 changes outside the Gates of Moria, the first featuring a discussion between Frodo and Gandalf. This is another extremely important scene that fleshes out multiple plot lines, specifically relating to Gandalf. First off, Gandalf asks Frodo how his shoulder is, after the wound he sustained earlier in the film, thereby reminding the audience that actions do have consequences. These characters are not invincible superheroes who can shrug off serious injuries. In the theatrical edition, however, this injury is not mentioned again until the end of the trilogy.
It's been 4 years to the day since Weathertop Sam. It's never really healed.
Gandalf then states that he has felt the power of the ring growing, which is another instance of the ring being personified as wanting to take advantage of the position that it finds itself in, namely that certain Boromirs in the Fellowship might serve its ends. Speaking of, Gandalf continues that evil will be drawn to the ring from outside of the Fellowship and from within, and the two look suspiciously at Boromir. This effectively maintains the threat posed by Boromir from the prior scene on the mountain, where Boromir was barely able to control himself. All of this serves to keep the tension and drama high, and does not allow for any downtime. This threat is constant, and the power of the ring is growing. Frodo then asks, "Who do I trust?" And Gandalf responds that he must trust himself. And Frodo, of course, follows this advice later in the film, when he resolves to travel to Mordor alone. And the final piece of tension ramping is when Gandalf tells Frodo, "There are many powers in this world for good and evil. Some are greater than I am, and against some I have not yet been tested."
We wanted to really emphasize the fact that Gandalf is sensing his impending doom, that he doesn't want to go into Moria. However, because Frodo has now made a decision, he's going to go along with it. But he wants to just take an opportunity to warn Frodo that from here on in the journey is going to get more dangerous.
This, of course, further foreshadows his encounter with the Balrog, which was hinted at in the previous cutaway in one of Saruman's books. Overall, this scene primarily exists to maintain a constant level of tension and unease. Gandalf essentially tells Frodo, "The ring is getting stronger. Be constantly on guard against enemies and friends. Don't trust anyone. Some evils in Middle-earth are stronger than I am, and some evils in Middle-earth I have never fought against." This is all fantastic storytelling, and the theatrical version is absolutely weaker for its exclusion. It was cut because of, ding ding ding, pacing reasons. I am going to place the Gates of Moria scene in A. The next addition at the Gates of Moria is a quick bit of world building that also serves as a character moment for Legolas and Gimli. Gimli tells the others that dwarf doors are invisible when closed, as he wants to impress his companions before they enter the great halls of Moria. He is very eager to be back with his kin after having spent time in Rivendell, and he very likely wants to one-up the elves. Gandalf then follows by saying that the dwarves themselves are unable to find their doors if they forget their secrets, prompting Legolas to say,
"Why doesn't that surprise me?"
Which is the second time the film has established tension between Legolas and Gimli. By this point in the theatrical edition, we only had Gimli's outburst during the Council of Elrond.
"The ring must be destroyed."
And I suppose you think you're the one to do it. I will be dead before I see the ring in the hands of an elf. Never trust an elf!
And the suggestion is that the two basically don't speak to each other until after the events of the Fellowship of the Ring. The extended edition, however, builds their relationship in a more gradual and natural manner. This exchange was very likely cut because it has nothing to do with Frodo, the side effect being that Legolas and Gimli's relationship and characterization suffer in the theatrical edition. This is still quite a minor change, and it doesn't really improve the film by much, and so I am going to give this scene a B. The final addition at the Gates of Moria is that, after failing in his initial attempt to open the doors, Gandalf tries a second spell that also fails. Pippin then notes that nothing is happening, asks Gandalf what he is going to do, and Gandalf responds,
"Knock your head against these doors, Peregrine Took, and if that does not shatter them, and I am allowed a little peace from foolish questions."
This sets up the fact that Gandalf finds Pippin incredibly annoying, which then gives further context to the later scene where Pippin accidentally knocks the skeleton down the well. This is not necessary, but it does serve as an additional instance of Gandalf being frustrated at Pippin, which then feeds very well into their developed relationship in The Return of the King. It also shows that Gandalf attempts multiple times to open the doors, rather than simply trying one spell before resorting to pushing the door open. It obviously takes longer to depict Gandalf trying twice instead of once, but I would argue that this shows that the Fellowship is actually a bit stuck. Gandalf demonstrates that he has multiple spells at his disposal. None of them work, resulting in him having to unsuccessfully search the door for the right word. Whereas in the theatrical edition, Gandalf casts a spell, and then no progress is made until Frodo realizes it is a riddle.
There was a lot of concern about whether Gandalf should appear too much of a failure here, and I guess the slightly longer cut shows more of his frustration. But I actually always loved it. I thought that to make Gandalf fallible, to show that even though he's this spirit, he is inhabited in the body of an old man, he does forget things, he's not always perfect. I think it was really nice for his character. It's anti-wizard in a funny kind of way.
However, this isn't strictly necessary and doesn't really add anything to the film other than giving Gandalf a chance to vent his frustration at Pippin. The total runtime that is saved by cutting out these 3 exchanges at the Gates of Moria is about 90 seconds. If Peter Jackson was this desperate to reduce the runtime for the theatrical edition, one option would have been to skip both of Gandalf's failed attempts to open the door and simply have it open the first time. Had they done this, the only real thing that would have been lost would be Frodo being the one to work out the riddle, which is likely why this wasn't considered to be an option in the original script.
The idea of giving the solving of the puzzle to Frodo, which some people sort of objected to because, of course, Gandalf himself solves it in the book, was basically because by this stage Frodo's starting to drop out of the story. And always one of the things we had to work very hard to do was to keep him in focus and keep him very proactive so that he's not just somebody who's being dragged along by other people.
I'm going to give this change a C, because it does certainly slow the film down with, honestly, not much in the way of trade-offs. Once inside Moria, we have a couple more extended sequences. The first is when Gandalf tells the Fellowship of Mithril and mentions that Thorin had previously given Bilbo a Mithril shirt, Gandalf never having told Bilbo that the shirt was worth more than the Shire. This serves a couple of purposes. One is fan service, and it calls back to the Hobbit novel by name-dropping Thorin. More importantly, however, we get some valuable world building by explaining where Mithril actually comes from, as without any kind of explanation, as in the theatrical edition, it could seem as though Bilbo simply gave Frodo a literal piece of plot armor without any kind of elaboration as to where it came from, why he has one, and why no one else is wearing one. The extended edition clarifies that Mithril comes from Moria, and that it was gifted to Bilbo by Thorin. The specific reference to Thorin will mean nothing to people who had not read the Hobbit novel, or I guess seen the films now that those exist. But even if we purely go from what the Lord of the Rings trilogy gives us, it can be reasonably assumed that this Thorin person was somehow involved in Bilbo's past adventures. And of course we get multiple references to those past adventures. It can also be inferred that one reason why there are no other Mithril shirts is because Mithril is incredibly rare and therefore expensive, and also because Moria has evidently been out of action for at least a couple of decades. On its most basic level, however, this extended scene reminds the audience of the Mithril shirt, and thanks to the additional setup by way of world building, when we get to the payoff with the troll, it is more readily accepted that this shirt exists within the setting, rather than simply being a plot device that was established solely so as to be paid off later. During this scene, we also have a quick shot of Pippin holding Merry to make sure he doesn't fall off, which is very brief, but is a nice character moment between the two of them. This sequence is not entirely necessary, but is definitely nice to have, and so I am going to place it in B. Now for one that is absolutely necessary, and the mind boggles trying to understand why on earth this was cut. I genuinely could not believe that this next one was not in the theatrical edition. In the theatrical edition, Gandalf explains to Frodo that Gollum is following them, that he was potentially set loose from Barad-dûr, and that he hates and loves the ring, as he hates and loves himself. Only in the extended edition does Gandalf tell Frodo that Gollum was once called Smeagol before the ring found him and drove him mad. Removing this 15 seconds or so is baffling, Because in The Two Towers, Frodo first establishes a friendship with Gollum after he addresses him by his real name, Smeagol.
Gandalf told me you were one of the river folk. He said your life was a sad story. You were not so very different from a hobbit once. Were you, Smeagol?
What did you call me?
That was your name once, wasn't it?
Smeagol.
And this also triggers Gollum's internal conflict. This is an incredibly important character moment for both Frodo and Gollum, and in the theatrical versions of the films, it very much appears as though Frodo has simply pulled the name Smeagol out of thin air, thus functioning as a payoff without a setup.
We trimmed a little reference here out of the theatrical version which refers to Gollum as Smeagol. And we trimmed it out because we didn't need it in this film, but I'm including it here because this whole concept of Gollum's original name being Smeagol is something that's very important in The Two Towers, and so I wanted it back in this version of the film.
This justification, unfortunately, doesn't make a huge amount of sense, because whilst, yes, Gollum's real name being Smeagol is a plot point that is entirely unimportant to the plot of The Fellowship of the Ring, this plot point is critically important to the plot of The Lord of the Rings, of which The Fellowship of the Ring is a part. By this logic, all references to the Eye of Sauron, Barad-dûr, Mount Doom, Narsil, and Minas Tirith should also have been removed, because they do not become important until subsequent movies. This is a particularly confusing omission because the rest of the dialogue in this scene deals with Gandalf warning Frodo against being judgmental of Gollum, and suggesting that he thinks Gollum still has a part to play. If we use the aforementioned logic, this dialogue also has nothing to do with the Fellowship of the Ring, and should therefore also have been cut, which would of course further damage the storytelling of the trilogy as a whole. Not showing the audience when and how Frodo learned of Gollum's true name is not comparable to, for example, the rather amusing fan theory that Frodo doesn't actually know Legolas's name. Because the two do not actually speak to each other on screen, with one exception.
And you have my bow. Come on!
We can reasonably infer that they spoke off-screen, and we can also reasonably infer that Frodo obviously knows Legolas's name. Frodo knowing Legolas's name, however, is not a plot point, nor is it required for the story to function, hence the writers not inserting a scene where Frodo is told Legolas's name. Conversely, Frodo knowing that Gollum's real name was Smeagol is incredibly important, and so, no, it is not reasonable, in my view, to just assume that in the theatrical edition, at some point, Gandalf had a plot-relevant discussion with Frodo off-screen. This dialogue simply needs to be in the film, and it is going in S for that reason. There are a handful of small changes during the fight scene at Balin's tomb, primarily involving Aragorn and Boromir. In the extended edition, the troll immediately corners Sam, and Sam is then rescued by Aragorn and Boromir, who collectively pull on the chain around its neck. This leads to Boromir being thrown against a wall and momentarily being knocked out. An orc tries to kill him while he is down, and Aragorn kills the orc, nodding at Boromir to acknowledge that he has Boromir's back.
This little moment between Boromir and Aragorn is significant too, because it does show that their respect for each other is growing following the earlier antagonism between the two characters.
Now, you may think that this was cut because it doesn't focus on Frodo. However, there are many hero moments in the various fight scenes and battles that remain in the theatrical edition that have nothing to do with Frodo. And so I have absolutely no idea why the decision was made to remove this one in particular, given that it further builds the relationship between Aragorn and Boromir. Both characters develop an amount of respect for each other before the end of the film, and only through working together are they able to save Sam from the troll. This contains very clear character information that relates to both Aragorn and Boromir's character arcs, and again, if they were this desperate to shorten the runtime, they could have instead removed this shot of Gimli throwing his axe, or this shot of Legolas fighting with his knives. I am not suggesting that they should have done this instead. My point, however, is that neither the Gimli or the Legolas moment accomplishes anything other than fighting, and unlike the Aragorn and Boromir moment, they do not contain any useful character information. The changes to the Balin's tomb fight scene are going in A. As the Fellowship enters Lothlorien, both cuts of the film diverge slightly. In the theatrical edition, immediately after the elves surround the Fellowship, Aragorn addresses their leader, Haldir, by name, telling him that they come seeking help and that they need the elves' protection, indicating that Aragorn has a prior friendship with the elves of Lothlorien. Gimli then interrupts, saying,
Aragorn, these words are perilous. We should go back.
Which is rather amusing because he is very much stating the obvious to Aragorn, and then Haldir responds that as they have entered the realm of the Lady of the Water, they cannot go back, and that she is waiting for them. This is extremely efficient storytelling, and it very effectively keeps the narrative moving, as the Fellowship, yet again, find themselves with no choice but to venture deeper into potential danger. In the extended edition, an unspecified amount of time passes after the elves surround the Fellowship, suggesting that Haldir is unsure of what exactly to do with them. This is because, in contrast to the theatrical edition, Haldir did not appear to know that they were coming. We know that Galadriel knew that they were coming. She and Celeborn explicitly knew that 9 companions left Rivendell, and yet only 8 remain. And so why Haldir was not aware is unknown. Haldir addresses Legolas first, recognizing him as the son of Thranduil, and the fact that he speaks to Legolas first makes sense, given that they are both elves. He then addresses Aragorn, recognizing him as being one of the Dunedain. Gimli, meanwhile, has become extremely irritated by Haldir, and asks him to speak in a language they can all understand. Haldir replies that the elves of Lothlorien have not had dealings with the dwarves since the Dark Days, thus providing a hint as to where the tension between their people originated. Haldir has no interest in being polite to Gimli, and the only reason Gimli is still breathing is likely because he is accompanied by Legolas and Aragorn. Gimli then proceeds to insult Haldir in Khuzdul, translated as, "I spit upon your grave." All of this further builds the tension and rivalry between the elves and dwarves, thereby assisting the character arcs of both Gimli and Legolas, and also throws in a nice bit of world building for good measure. Aragorn then admonishes Gimli for being extremely rude to their allies, either because he is able to speak Khuzdul and understood what Gimli just said, or because he simply understood that Gimli was saying something extremely rude because he doesn't like elves. Next comes a minor change that I think amounts to a very slight point against the extended edition.
You bring great evil with you.
Elves can detect the presence of evil, according to Peter Jackson, and presumably also according to Tolkien. However, if this is the case, it is not communicated particularly well in the films. This is not a factor in the theatrical edition, as Galadriel is the only elf who appears to be psychic, and she is clearly more powerful than the others. Her foreknowledge of Frodo's arrival with the ring can be attributed to her being incredibly powerful. In the extended edition, however, we have to accept that Haldir, and presumably elves in general, are able to detect evil, as this is the only explanation that makes sense. The alternative explanation would be that Galadriel knew that Frodo was coming, as in the theatrical edition, and she told Haldir, hence Haldir knowing that Frodo was carrying a great evil. But this wouldn't make sense, because if this were the case, why would Haldir initially refuse to help the Fellowship? Anyway, as a result of Frodo carrying a great evil, he informs them that they can go no further, until, after an off-screen discussion with Aragorn, he agrees and takes them further into Lothlorien. Haldir introduces Caras Galadhon as the heart of Elvendom on Earth, and names Celeborn and Galadriel before the Fellowship meet them. This brief moment I don't really see the point of including, as it only name-drops things to the audience 1 minute prior to us seeing them for ourselves. Haldir could have agreed to help, and then cut to them entering Caras Galadhon, which would have saved time and also removed redundant dialogue. Rewinding momentarily, whilst Aragorn is talking to Haldir, we get an incredibly effective moment within the greater context of Boromir's story, as this is the only time Boromir exchanges dialogue with Frodo after leaving Rivendell. In the theatrical edition, Boromir does not speak to Frodo until the later scene where he attempts to take the ring. Even when he decides to join the Fellowship, he does not pledge himself to Frodo in the same way that Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli did. He instead says to Frodo, "You carry the fate of us all, little one," before telling Elrond, "If this is the will of the Council, Gondor will see it done." He also does not speak to Frodo on the mountain when he returns the ring to Frodo. The only scene in which Frodo and Boromir actually speak to each other is the scene where Boromir betrays the Fellowship and attempts to take the ring. In the theatrical edition, Boromir is set up as a very shifty and suspicious character who is waiting for the chance to take the ring. In the extended edition, Boromir is significantly more fleshed out, and small moments like this extended scene in Lothlorien greatly assist in conveying this.
Gandalf's death was not in vain, nor would he have you give up hope. You carry a heavy burden, Frodo. Don't carry the weight of the dead.
Boromir not only reassures Frodo that Gandalf's death was not in vain, which is a generally nice thing to do and could be informed simply by the fact that Boromir has developed a friendship with the other hobbits, but he also specifically addresses Frodo's burden of the ring. This gives Boromir far more depth and complexity, as he is no longer a man who simply loses control whenever he hears the word ring. He empathizes with and understands what Frodo is going through, as Boromir has no doubt lost many close friends in the service of his city, and given the added context provided by the extended scene in the Two Towers, Boromir is absolutely aware of the corrupting influence of the ring, and he, like Frodo, is desperately trying to fight it. This is one of many very small moments that help make Boromir in the extended edition a far more detailed and overall superior character to Boromir in the theatrical edition. So the Haldir stuff I would put in C, because although it fleshes out the rivalry between the elves and the dwarves, it does slow the film down and also introduces a one-off ability that the elves apparently have. The Boromir stuff, however, gets an easy A, which I think averages this out to a B. When the Fellowship meets with Galadriel and Celeborn, we have a handful of extended changes. In the theatrical edition, Celeborn opens by saying,
8 that are here, yet 9 there were set out from Rivendell. Tell me, where is Gandalf? For I much desire to speak with him.
Immediately addressing the distinct lack of Gandalf. In the extended edition, however, Celeborn opens by saying,
The enemy knows you have entered here. What hope you had in secrecy is now gone.
Which functions to maintain a constant level of threat and urgency before he then asks where Gandalf is. In both cuts, Galadriel answers the question, although only in the extended edition does she state,
Gandalf the Grey did not pass the borders of this land.
The extended edition also includes Legolas's explicit explanation that Gandalf was killed by a Balrog before Galadriel consoles the Fellowship, saying that they do not yet know Gandalf's full purpose. This is nice to have, but its removal in the theatrical edition for pacing reasons is justifiable. What is less justifiable is the removal of Galadriel's line to Gimli.
Do not let the great emptiness of Khazad-dûm fill your heart.
As this functions as the first moment of character growth for Gimli. He, of course, does not like elves, and he previously referred to Galadriel as an elf witch, who is not dissimilar to a siren, as he claimed all who look upon her fall under her spell and are never seen again. In this extended scene, however, Gimli is shown to be totally wrong about Galadriel, and Galadriel does not appear to harbour any kind of prejudice against dwarves, which also helps to establish Galadriel as being an extremely powerful being who is unlike normal elves. This scene was an unfortunate casualty of the desire to tighten up the pacing for the theatrical release. However, once again, it ejects important character development for the side characters.
The Lothlorien sequence was always very difficult for us in the movie because it's a point in the film where you naturally would be wanting to increase the pace and be building up a sense of momentum to head towards the climax of the movie. But obviously the sequence in Lothlorien is very, very significant in the book. It's significant in the movie as well because it's the point that Frodo has to decide whether or not he really is best staying with the Fellowship or leaving, and Galadriel obviously gives him advice. But we always had pacing problems, and when we cut the theatrical version, we wanted to make it as brief as we possibly could so we could propel the story along. But I felt that this cut of the meeting with Galadriel and Celeborn was actually better in that it starts to suck you into the world of the elves and the world of Galadriel in a way that I think is ultimately a little bit more effective than the truncated version that ended up in the movie.
After the meeting with Galadriel and Celeborn, we have a very slight adjustment in the extended edition. As the elves sing, Legolas tells the hobbits that they are mourning Gandalf, at which point Sam says,
But they don't mention his fireworks. Should be a verse about them.
And he proceeds to ad-lib a rhyming verse to try to honour Gandalf in his own way. This is an excellent character moment for Sam, and it also calls back directly to the earlier scenes in the film, thereby reminding the audience of just how far these characters have already come, and how much has changed since they left their home. Unfortunately, this rather sincere and heartfelt moment is undercut with physical comedy.
We're after thunder. Silver showers.
There is nothing wrong with the Gimli snoring gag, but intercutting it with Sam paying tribute to Gandalf feels like the kind of tonal inconsistency that is more characteristic of the Hobbit trilogy. And thankfully, this kind of thing is an extreme rarity in The Lord of the Rings. Overall, I will give the Caras Galadhon scene a B. It has an important moment for Gimli, and a touching moment of Sam paying tribute to Gandalf. However, it does also include an out-of-place gag, and as Peter Jackson correctly concluded, it does slow the film down. In the subsequent scene with the Mirror of Galadriel, in both cuts, Frodo tells Galadriel that he cannot complete his quest alone, and Galadriel replies that to bear a ring of power is to be alone, thus reiterating Gandalf's earlier advice only seen in the extended edition.
You must trust yourself. Trust your own strength.
The extended edition, however, elaborates slightly by name-dropping Galadriel's ring of power, Nenya, thereby explicitly revealing that Galadriel is also a ring-bearer. This, I think, is entirely fan service. However, it is not quite as intrusive as the earlier scene with Bilbo's trolls. There is no narrative benefit to having Galadriel explicitly show Frodo her ring, as the dialogue in the theatrical edition very heavily implies that Galadriel is also a ring-bearer, given that she explains to Frodo what it is like to bear a ring of power. Cutting this out for pacing reasons is entirely justified, although it only saves about 10 seconds of screen time, so I am going to place this in C. Up next is one of the most iconic scenes in the extended edition, the giving of the gifts. This was an extremely unfortunate casualty of Peter Jackson's decision to streamline the film for the theatrical release, and to improve the pacing by getting the Fellowship in and out of Lothlorien as quickly as possible.
Introducing Galadriel and the concept of Lothlorien was difficult. It was also difficult in terms of the story of the film, because it's one of those situations where if you were writing an original screenplay, Lothlorien probably wouldn't exist, because you'd be wanting to keep the momentum up straight through to the climax. That we always regarded Lothlorien as being potentially problematical because of the way that it suddenly stops the narrative of the film.
And to be clear, he did a fantastic job. The theatrical edition does have superior pacing, and the changes to the Lothlorien sequence are the main reason for this, as in the theatrical edition, we spend just over 14 minutes in Lothlorien, whereas in the extended edition, we spend a substantially longer 22.5 minutes in Lothlorien, amounting to an increase of over 50%. The main downside to this decision, however, is that the Farewell to Lorien extended scene was sacrificed in the name of pacing. There is so much contained in this extended scene that connects with other parts of the trilogy that I will no doubt not catch everything, but here goes. Celeborn tells the Fellowship that
never before have we clad strangers in the garb of our own people.
Which further establishes that the various races of Middle-earth are deciding to cooperate in order to defeat Sauron. This is originally introduced during the Council of Elrond, and later the cooperation of both Rohan and Gondor become important plot points. Celeborn then gifts the entire Fellowship with elven cloaks to help shield them from unfriendly eyes, which pays off twice in the Two Towers. Once when Frodo conceals himself and Sam from the Easterlings at the Black Gate, and again when Pippin leaves the elven brooch for Aragorn to find. Both of these scenes function far better with the inclusion of this extended scene, because without it, the scene at the Black Gate in particular functions as a payoff without a setup. And so in the theatrical edition, the audience has to assume, oh, well, I guess they have a cloak that can do that, and it appears to come out of nowhere. We then have the introduction of lembas bread, which establishes how exactly the Fellowship are traveling so far and yet not carrying an insane amount of food with them. Lembas bread becomes particularly important in The Return of the King, as it becomes a source of conflict between Frodo, Sam, and Gollum. And additionally, we get some excellent comic relief in the form of Pippin.
How many did you eat? 4.
Which works because it plays off of the fact that this kind of thing is exactly what Pippin would do, and it does not undercut anything else about this scene. Unlike Gimli snoring, this is not a cheap gag inserted because comedy. This is a character-driven act that is, incidentally, very funny. Celeborn then speaks with Aragorn, the purpose of this being to build tension for the upcoming conflict with Saruman's Uruk-hai.
Seldom do orcs journey the open under the sun, yet these have done so.
He continues that these orcs have travelled in the open under the sun, which is an extreme rarity for orcs. This detail is not technically necessary, as this was set up much earlier in the film.
He's breeding an army in the caverns of Isengard, an army that can move in sunlight.
However, reintroducing it here does help to ramp up the tension for the finale. Celeborn then gives Aragorn a dagger. Notably, Aragorn later uses this dagger during his fight with Lurtz, and Celeborn suggests that as they are being tracked, they can potentially outrun their enemy if they leave by boat, which explains this decision, although, again, it is not absolutely necessary to explain this. Legolas is then given a bow, and him having a particularly nice bow is not in and of itself something that warrants inclusion, as we could readily assume that Legolas, the master archer that he is, already has a very nice bow.
The bow of the Galadhrim, worthy of the skill of our woodland kin.
What this does accomplish, however, is that it draws a distinction between the Elves of Lothlorien and their woodland kin, and thereby builds on the theme of the free peoples of Middle-earth uniting to defeat Sauron. Merry and Pippin are given the daggers of the Noldorin, which replaced the ones Aragorn gave them previously. Galadriel tells them that the daggers have already seen service in war, and Pippin is unsure of how to respond, as he knows nothing about fighting, and yet he has just been given a weapon that has already taken many lives. Galadriel reassures him that he will find his courage, which, of course, he does. Additionally, Merry ends up using this dagger to help Éowyn defeat the Witch King later in the trilogy. This is a tiny moment that is not strictly necessary, but is very much appreciated. Sam is then given a length of elven rope, which is used in both the theatrical and extended versions of The Two Towers, and we also briefly see Sam getting into one of the boats, and being very uneasy about being on water. This is extremely brief, but feeds into Sam's actions at the end of the film, given the hint that Sam potentially can't swim in this scene. Galadriel does not offer Gimli a gift, and instead asks him what gift he wants. Gimli asks for nothing, except to look upon her one last time. He then asks for a single hair from her golden head, and she gives him 3. This further builds upon the character of Gimli, and the very fact that Legolas asks Gimli what gift he got from Galadriel indicates that Legolas is also developing a friendship with Gimli. In the theatrical edition, Gimli does not receive any development in the Fellowship of the Ring. He departs Rivendell with the Fellowship with a clear dislike of elves and Legolas in particular. He arrives at Lothlorien, still with a clear dislike of elves, and at the end of the film he joins Aragorn alongside Legolas to rescue Merry and Pippin. By the time we reach the Two Towers, Legolas and Gimli appear to have formed some kind of baseline friendship. However, in the theatrical editions, this happens almost entirely off-screen, and therefore is nowhere near as effective.
You know, it's kind of the change in Gimli. He starts to see that there are other breeds of people out there that can be influential in his life.
Yeah. Great theme that goes through the story, isn't it?
Yeah. Nice colour of
racial tolerance.
Yeah. Oh god, yeah. 2 races that couldn't hate each other more, and how they can become the greatest of friends.
This interaction with Gimli also makes Galadriel slightly more, for lack of a better word, human than she is in the theatrical edition, as all of her original scenes are very ominous and serious.
It's lovely to see Kate smiling there too, because I know some of the criticism that people had of the Galadriel character in the theatrical version is the fact that she had this sort of slightly frightening, heavy persona, which it was appropriate for the scene that she was playing, but we did originally film these moments which are more like the Galadriel from the book, where she has a little bit more of a fun-loving spirit.
Anyway, Galadriel does not give Aragorn an additional gift, stating that he has already been given the greatest gift by Arwen, Galadriel's granddaughter. She tells him that she fears Arwen's grace will diminish if she stays in Middle-earth, and Aragorn responds that he wishes for her to leave him and go to Valinor with her people. This is the first time Valinor has been mentioned, although the Grey Havens were mentioned in the Passing of the Elves extended scene. This is, however, a far better time to introduce Valinor, as it relates specifically to Arwen, and Aragorn's guilt that she is sacrificing her immortality for him. The concept that travelling to Valinor will preserve the elves' immortality is an important one, and introducing it here is far preferable to the earlier deleted scene. Galadriel then continues that Arwen needs to make this choice herself, and that similarly, Aragorn must make a choice. Will he rise above his ancestors, or fall into darkness? This reiterates what Elrond discussed with Aragorn in the deleted scene in Rivendell regarding his desire to see Aragorn take up the Sword of Kings and assume his place as the leader of the Men of Middle-earth. With Aragorn's reluctance to do this only being a plot point in the extended edition, it makes Aragorn in the theatrical edition far less conflicted, as all we know is that he is the heir to the throne of Gondor, and yet for some reason he has lived as a ranger and not pursued his birthright. And then this just kind of doesn't come up again until Boromir accepts Aragorn as his king at the end of the film. This is then not mentioned again until halfway through The Two Towers.
If Sauron is defeated and Aragorn made king and all that you hope for comes true.
At this point, we finally tie back in with the theatrical edition. The various gifts themselves all appear later in the trilogy. However, the only gift we see being given in the theatrical edition is the Light of Erendil. This one is the most narratively important because it plays a key role in defeating Shelob in The Return of the King. However, there is so much important information present in this extended scene that, although I do understand why it was cut, I can't give it any lower than an S. This scene is iconic. It sets up multiple things that become relevant later, and it contains fantastic character moments. In the extended edition, we get an additional scene halfway down the Anduin, but the actual Anduin this time, you silly woman. The Fellowship stops to make camp for the night, which helps to establish that time is passing, and that the various locations of Middle-earth are further than a film set's walk away. Sam encourages Frodo to eat something, as he hasn't eaten anything all day. This tells us that Sam is trying to take good care of Frodo. He promised Gandalf that he would help Frodo, and he feels this responsibility more than ever now that Gandalf has died. Frodo, however, refuses to eat and says that Sam can't help him. The implication here is that Frodo has taken on board Gandalf and Galadriel's words.
You must trust yourself.
To bear a ring of power is to be alone.
And he wants to distance himself from Sam in order to do what must be done.
Then I know what I must do. It's just, I'm afraid to do it.
This directly leads into Frodo's decisions at the end of the film, which is an incredibly important character moment for him, and this scene makes this moment even more powerful because Frodo is already preparing himself to leave. Meanwhile, Boromir keeps watch and notices that Gollum is still following them, which establishes that he has managed to track them since Moria. In the theatrical edition, Gollum is never seen, nor is he mentioned after the scene in Moria until his introduction in The Two Towers.
Gollum. He has tracked us since Moria.
Boromir is worried that Gollum will alert the enemy to their presence, but Aragorn has greater concerns. He has a Boromir to deal with. In their previous conversation, which appears in both cuts of the film, Boromir believed that he had established a form of kinship with Aragorn. This did not appear to be any kind of ruse to help him acquire the ring, and this was brought about due to him being very emotional after Galadriel foretells of the fall of Gondor.
I heard her voice inside my head. She spoke of my father and the fall of Gondor.
Boromir appears to be absolutely genuine in this scene, which is partly why, in the extended edition in particular, he is such a fantastic character. Boromir asks Aragorn if he has ever seen the White Tower, and if he has ever been called home by the ringing of trumpets. Aragorn responds that yes, he has seen the White City a long time ago. Boromir then tells him,
One day our paths will lead us there, and the Tower Guard shall take up the call. The Lords of Gondor have returned.
Boromir appears at this point to have accepted Aragorn as a Lord of Gondor, like him, although he does not yet fully acknowledge him as his king. Aragorn then smiles briefly at Boromir, but then his face drops. He has no intention of going anywhere near Minas Tirith, and he knows this is going to cause him to clash with Boromir in future. In the theatrical edition, this does not cause him to clash with Boromir in future. They do not actually speak to each other again after this scene until Boromir is dying, which means that in the theatrical edition, Aragorn and Boromir's relationship only travels in one direction. They clash at the council, with Boromir stating that Gondor needs no king. They clash again on the mountain when Aragorn orders Boromir to return the ring to Frodo. Boromir later comes to the realization, both through his experience of fighting alongside Aragorn in Moria and through being very distressed at Galadriel's prophetic tidings of doom, that Aragorn is, like him, a Lord of Gondor, rather than a mere ranger. And, as he dies, he accepts Aragorn as his brother, his captain, and his king. All of this is absolute fucking gold. However, it gets even better in the extended edition, where Boromir's relationship with Aragorn is far more turbulent. Firstly, Aragorn does not accept Boromir's offer of friendship when they first meet. As in the theatrical edition, they clash at the council and again on the mountain, and Boromir later accepts Aragorn as a Lord of Gondor. What happens next, however, entirely changes the nature of their final scene together, and, critically, informs Boromir's actions when he attempts to take the ring from Frodo. After discussing Gollum, Boromir reiterates to Aragorn that they should go to Minas Tirith, as this is safer than their current path through Emyn Muil. This is the second time Boromir has suggested this.
Make for the camp of Rohan! I take the west road to my city!
Boromir believes that, after their conversation in Lothlorien, he will be able to convince Aragorn to redirect the Fellowship to Minas Tirith. Again, Boromir is not simply being sketchy because the ring has his nuts in a vice. Boromir was sent specifically to recover the ring, and he appears to genuinely believe that the Fellowship heading to Minas Tirith is the best move. He still believes that the ring can be used as a weapon. Aragorn, however, replies that there is no strength in Gondor that can aid them, which makes Boromir angry.
You were quick enough to trust the elves. Have you so little faith in your own people?
This indicates to Boromir that Aragorn trusts the elves more than he trusts his own people.
I think it's that things have come to a head, and the fact that Boromir thinks that Aragorn cares more for the elves or for his other way of life than the human side, and he says there is honour to be found in men. There's goodness, okay, we've of course some bad things in the world, but we're not unsavable.
After their last conversation, this comes as something of a surprise to Boromir. Aragorn then attempts to leave, as he has no intention of arguing the point. However, Boromir grabs him and accuses him of being a coward.
You are afraid. All your life, you have hidden in the shadows.
As a quick aside, the film shows us that Frodo can hear this conversation, which very likely informs his own actions later in the film. Anyway, this prompts Aragorn to tell Boromir conclusively that he will not take the ring anywhere near Gondor.
I will not lead the ring within 100 leagues of your city.
Notice how Aragorn very specifically says, your city. He shoots down Boromir's suggestion that they are both lords of Gondor, and makes it clear that he does not trust Gondor or its leaders. They are not his people. They are Boromir's people. This is already fantastic development on its own, but it also plays into two crucial moments that are yet to come. Firstly, Boromir leaves this conversation incredibly pissed off, which then informs his decision to corner Frodo and take the ring. In the theatrical edition, Boromir leaves because he's kind of been sus the whole time and the ring corrupts him, and you know how it goes. The extended edition, however, does ample work to ensure that Boromir is not depicted as a weak man. He does not simply get corrupted by the ring. He is terrified of the ring, and he knows the power it exerts, but at the same time, he believes it may be their only shot at defeating Sauron. Because Boromir is very much a flawed character, he decides to confront Frodo, with his goal being to take the ring to Minas Tirith, regardless of Aragorn's feelings on the matter. His attempts to do so are certainly exaggerated by the corrupting influence of the ring, but his reason for doing so comes from a genuine love for his people, which is far better explored in the extended edition. And secondly, this plays directly into Boromir's death scene. In the theatrical edition, Aragorn still says, "I will not let the White City fall, nor our people fail." And Boromir repeats,
"Our people."
He appreciates the sentiment, although in the theatrical edition, this would not have been a surprise to either us or Boromir. Aragorn does not show any apprehensiveness regarding either his heritage or Gondor in general, and so, yeah, he obviously refers to the Gondorians as our people. However, this takes on a completely new meaning in the extended edition.
This was a scene that was potentially very helpful between Aragorn and Boromir, that we did feel that we wanted them to go into Amon Hen and into Boromir's ultimate sacrifice and death with a certain amount of estrangement. Because the last time we had a scene between these two characters, obviously it was a scene with much more warmth in the Lothlorien forest.
We wanted those two great characters to part on bad terms. It's almost like lovers. I mean, you know, that adds pathos, of course, to the death scene.
Aragorn very specifically says, our people. Boromir's sacrifice and redemption has made Aragorn, subconsciously or otherwise, refer to the Gondorians as our people, thereby acknowledging that he has ties to the people of Gondor, when he previously referred to Minas Tirith, rather disparagingly, as your city. Boromir has proven to Aragorn that Aragorn was wrong. There is honour and strength left in men.
Yes, there is weakness, there is frailty, but there is courage also, and honour to be found in men.
Upon hearing Aragorn accept the Gondorians as our people, Boromir then accepts Aragorn as his king before he passes. This development is not present in the theatrical edition, and its inclusion elevates what was, in my view, already the most emotionally effective moment of The Lord of the Rings, and cements Boromir as my favourite character in my favourite film. It also makes Aragorn's decision to take Boromir's braces with him after Boromir's death more meaningful. This extended scene contains excellent character development for Sam and Frodo, but contains critical character development for Aragorn and Boromir, and therefore, I can't place this scene any lower than S. The changes to the climax of the film are minor, but I will briefly detail them. In the extended edition, Legolas shoots 6 Uruks, whereas in the theatrical edition he only shoots 3. This was likely trimmed to keep up the pace and intensity of the sequence, as the camera holds on Legolas for almost 10 seconds, and the only real purpose of this is the cool factor. Legolas is admittedly cooler than the underside of a penguin's scrotum, but trimming this does marginally improve the pacing of the action sequence. We also get further action as Aragorn rushes to assist Boromir. Aragorn kills 3 Uruks, whilst Boromir kills 2, and Merry and Pippin finish one off using their daggers, and we then have 2 additional shots of them throwing stones to help Boromir from a distance. There are 2 specific shots that were cut for rating reasons, this dismemberment and this throat slit, which doesn't really make a huge amount of sense to me, as Lurtz's death is far more explicit than either of these, and yet it remains in the film fully intact, pun intended. These shots are nothing particularly notable in terms of the action they contain, however, all of this is intercut with the appearance of Lurtz and him readying his bow. This sequence also begins with Aragorn responding to Boromir's call for aid. Therefore, all footage during this sequence functions so as to dial up the tension before the inevitable happens. In the theatrical edition, it takes 48 seconds from Boromir blowing the horn of Gondor the first time to Boromir being shot. The extended edition, however, extends, funny how it does that, a full 30 seconds longer. This is a risk, because if sequences like this go on for too long, then instead of becoming more intense before reaching a climax, they can become boring, and the audience can be left thinking, alright, hurry up, get to the point. The reason this works so well in the extended edition, however, is because as the tension escalates, the combat also escalates. In the theatrical edition, Boromir blows the horn. They fight. He blows the horn a second time, they try to run, Lurtz arrives and Boromir is shot. In the extended edition, Boromir blows the horn, they fight, we see Aragorn battle his way to Boromir, Boromir blows the horn a second time but is interrupted whilst doing so, thereby indicating that he is already being overwhelmed. They try to run, the hobbits start throwing stones to protect Boromir, then Lurtz arrives and Boromir is shot. The hobbits are also directly involved in the combat, finishing off an Uruk on the ground before starting to throw rocks to assist Boromir, whereas in the theatrical edition, the hobbits are entirely helpless. This sequence is excellent in both versions, but I marginally prefer the extended version, as it shows that Merry and Pippin do have agency, although the film thankfully keeps their impact on the fighting to a minimum. Had this dial been cranked too high, as seen in certain other movies, then firstly, it would have made the Uruks less of a threat, and secondly, it would have lessened the impact of Boromir's sacrifice. It also tweaks the nature of their friendship, as although Boromir sees them as essentially children that he is responsible for protecting, they are obviously not actually children, and they are able to fight alongside Boromir, albeit in an extremely limited manner. Additionally, in the background of these shots in the theatrical edition, you can still see Merry and Pippin throwing rocks, so if I were to be incredibly anal, I'd say the action flows slightly better in the extended edition. And the final change of this sequence is during Aragorn's fight with Lurtz. We have an extremely brief shot of Lurtz licking his own blood from Aragorn's blade. This is a tiny change, but it adds a bit of juicy flavour to Lurtz, and the only reason I can think that this would have been cut is for censorship reasons. Overall, the changes to this sequence are minor, although I feel the escalation of tension is marginally more effective in the extended edition, despite eating up valuable runtime. I am going to place this sequence in B. The final change to the extended edition is immediately after Boromir dies. Aragorn says,
"They will look for his coming from the White Tower, but he will not return."
This calls back specifically to their conversation in Lothlorien regarding them returning to Minas Tirith together. This additional line also clearly shows Aragorn's grief at Boromir's passing, and that he is very aware of the effect this will have on Gondor, which is a nice addition, but does not fundamentally change the emotional impact of Boromir's death, as we still get Aragorn's line,
Peace, son of Gondor.
So, I don't have particularly strong feelings regarding this change. Let's put it in B. So that brings us to the end of the Fellowship of the Ring. Of the extended or deleted scenes, we have 5 that expanded upon the properties of the ring. We also have 9 that provide generalized world building and depth to the setting. We have 1 that provides additional action, 3 that act as extremely important setups for future events, and 2 that primarily or only function as fan service. In terms of which characters had the most cut content, this is in terms of the number of scenes that were adjusted or deleted that contain character information, not taking into account the total amount of deleted runtime or the importance of this information. We have Pippin, who lost 1 scene, Gandalf and Legolas lost 2, Bilbo lost 3, Sam, Frodo and Gimli lost 4, and Aragorn and Boromir each have 6 instances of cut character work. Most interestingly, we have 8 instances of comic relief that are not present in the theatrical edition.
That Hobbit's only real passion is for food. They've never forgiven me for living this long.
Bilbo, have you been at the Gaffer's home brew?
No. Well, yes.
Rosie knows an idiot when she sees one. Does she?
What do they eat when they can't get Hobbit?
We're after thunder. Silver showers.
How many did you eat?
4.
In the theatrical edition, the instances of comedy include Gandalf's introduction, Sam being a terrible liar, Merry and Pippin's introduction with the firework and subsequent punishment, Pippin listing the things that they have stolen from Farmer Maggot in the past, Merry breaking a carrot, the iconic second breakfast scene, Merry and Pippin play fighting with Boromir, Gimli exaggerating his perceptiveness moments before being captured, and Merry saying, "I know it's working, run," as they flee the Uruks. With 2 minor exceptions, all of the comedy in the theatrical edition takes place in the first half of the film, as the second half is of course where most of the drama occurs. The extended edition almost doubles the number of jokes in the film. Only 2 of these jokes occur in the latter half, which means that, in stark contrast to the Hobbit movies, the Fellowship of the Ring does not repeatedly undermine its sincerity with cheap gags or absurd combat sequences, with one mildly irritating exception. The vast majority of the comedy added in the extended edition is entirely functional and effective, and whilst I might criticize the inclusion of some of those scenes for other reasons, the nature of the comedy is not one of them. There are also entire plot threads that are absent in the theatrical edition, namely Aragorn's arc involving not wanting to become king, and his distrust of Boromir, Gondor, and the race of men in general, and Gimli's gradual change regarding his prejudice against elves. The nature of the ring is substantially more fleshed out, as is Aragorn's relationship with Arwen, the racial friction between elves and dwarves, and Frodo gradually preparing himself to leave the Fellowship and journey alone. Most, if not all, of these changes were made in the name of pacing, but there came a point where Peter Jackson sacrificed storytelling in favor of pacing, resulting in the theatrical edition being marginally better paced than the extended edition, but suffering in almost every other area as a result. It almost seems like they went out of their way to remove every scene that gave Boromir and Aragorn's relationship additional depth. I fully understand that the process of cutting together a film as complex as this would have been a monumental task, which is partly why there are two separate versions of the film that are both exceptionally good. The issue, I think, stems from the fact that the side characters in The Lord of the Rings are some of the best side characters in movie history, and so any cut footage that involves either Boromir's relationship with Aragorn, or to a lesser extent Legolas's relationship with Gimli, feels like the movie is hamstringing itself to meet certain demands. These demands were, broadly, to limit the runtime, and to ensure that the film maintains its pace throughout. The way Peter Jackson accomplished this was to heavily focus the narrative specifically on Frodo, removing virtually all scenes that existed purely in service of the other characters. Peter Jackson's approach was absolutely successful, and if the extended edition did not exist, then there would be very few points of contention with the theatrical edition from a pure filmmaking perspective. The only three changes that I think actually make the film worse are the passing of the Elves scene, the Bilbo's Trolls line, and Gimli's ill-timed snoring, which, when added together, take up about 100 seconds of runtime and account for 0.8% of the total runtime. If I were to re-edit my perfect version of The Fellowship of the Ring, I would cut out these 100 seconds, but would keep the rest of the extended edition entirely as it is. The extended edition of The Fellowship of the Ring is a fantastic improvement upon what is already a masterpiece of filmmaking, and the positives vastly outweigh the negatives. Well, there you have it. People have been begging me to cover The Lord of the Rings for well over a year now, and I have wanted to do so ever since I started the channel. I wasn't exactly sure how to approach it, however. Because of my love for the series, I wanted to do it justice, but I also knew that I couldn't really do an analysis of it in the same way that I approached Rings of Power and The Hobbit. Focusing on the extended scenes, I think, is a good way to work out the differences between both versions of the film, and to thereby directly compare two things that are exceptionally good. If this video does well enough, then I will absolutely revisit this format for The Two Towers and The Return of the King, as well as a handful of other films where I have strong feelings regarding the various available cuts. If you have any in mind, please do let me know in the comments. Feel free to hop in the Discord, check out the second channel, links for both are in the description. Thank you again so much for your time, and I will see you in my next video.